The morning my daughter Tawny slid those papers across my kitchen table, she was sitting in her mother's chair. I don't know if she chose that chair on purpose. I don't know if she even thought about it, but I noticed. I noticed the way you notice everything when you have been living alone in a house for 3 years, and the silence has made you more observant than you ever wanted to be. She had a folder, navy blue, the kind you buy at an office supply store when you want something to look official without being too obvious about it. She set it on the table between us, and she folded her hands on top of it, and she looked at me with the expression I had seen on her face since she was 9 years old. The expression that meant she had already decided how something was going to go and was waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. She said, "Dad, I need you to really hear me on this." I said, "I'm listening." She said, "This house is too big for one person. You know that. Mom would have known that. And Derek and I have found a solution that works for everyone." She opened the folder. She slid the papers across the table. She placed a pen beside them. She said, "Just sign here. It's the right thing to do." I looked at the papers. I looked at my daughter. And then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and I placed a document on the table that she had never seen before. I said, "Tawny, I think there's been a misunderstanding." What happened next took about 4 minutes, but it had taken me 3 months to build it. This is the story of what happens when a daughter mistakes her father's grief for surrender. My name is Jason Merrill. I am 71 years old. I was born in Asheville, North Carolina, and with the exception of 4 years at NC State studying business, I have lived within 40 miles of where I was born for my entire life. I am not a man who needed to go far to find what he was looking for. What I was looking for turned out to be 20 minutes down the road in a woman named Hazel Pruitt, who I met at a church picnic in the summer of 1979 when I was 27 years old, and she was 25, and wearing a yellow dress and arguing with her brother about something I could not hear from where I was. Standing, but which looked, from the expression on her face, like she was absolutely right about. I walked over and introduced myself. She looked at me like I was interrupting, which I was, and then she smiled and I was finished. We were married 11 months later. We had Tawny in 1984 and Chris in 1986. In 1987, we bought the house on Birchwood Lane, 4 bedrooms, a covered porch, a yard that ran down to a creek where the kids caught crawdads every summer until they were old enough to be embarrassed by it and then kept doing it anyway because the creek didn't care about embarrassment, and neither did Hazel. For 28 years, I ran a timber supply company. We supplied lumber to residential contractors across 4 states. I built it from a single truck and a lease on a half-empty warehouse on the east side of Asheville, and I sold it 8 years ago to a regional conglomerate for enough money that I never had to think about board feet again. I am not a man who needs people to know what he has. Hazel used to say that was my best quality, and my most frustrating one. She said it made me trustworthy and invisible in equal measure, and both things were true. The business sale gave us options we had spent 30 years talking about. We were going to travel. Hazel had a list. Portugal first, then Japan, then a river cruise in France. She had been cutting pictures out of magazines about for years. We bought the tickets for Portugal in January of 2021. In March of that same year, she went to the doctor for what she thought was indigestion. It was not indigestion. Pancreatic cancer does not negotiate. It does not offer second opinions that change anything important. We had 11 months, and I will not use this story to describe those 11 months in detail because they belong to us and not to anyone else. What I will say is that Hazel faced it the way she faced everything, directly, without pretending it was something other than what it was, and that in those 11 months she told me things I have thought about every single day since she passed. One of the things she told me was about the house. She said, "Jason, don't let anyone talk you out of that house until you're ready. You'll know when you're ready, and until then you stay." She passed in February of 2022. She was 66 years old. We had been married for 43 years, and she had chosen every paint color in every room of that house and refinished the hardwood floors in the hallway twice, and both times declared the result imperfect and worth it. I stayed. I want to tell you about both of my children because you need to understand who they are before you can understand what happened. Chris is 40 years old. He lives in Hendersonville with his wife Karen and their two boys, 8 and 10, who are loud and funny and look exactly like Hazel did in the photographs from her childhood that I keep in an album on the shelf in the study. Chris works in facilities management for a hospital network, and he is the kind of man who shows up without being asked. In the 3 years since Hazel passed, he has come to Birchwood Lane every 2 weeks without exception. He fixes whatever needs fixing. He fills the pantry when it gets low. He sits on the porch with me in the evenings, and we don't always talk about much, and that is exactly enough. Tawny is 42. She lives in Charlotte with her husband Derek, who has been in commercial real estate for 12 years and who I have always found difficult to read. Derek is the kind of man who makes excellent conversation at dinner, and about whom you realize afterward you have learned nothing. He asks good questions. He gives very little back. In business, I would have recognized that immediately as a negotiating posture. In a son-in-law, I told myself it was just his nature. Tawny has her mother's eyes and her mother's certainty and almost none of her mother's patience. She is not a cruel person. I want to be clear about that. She loves me. I have never doubted that she loves me. But Tawny has always believed that love entitles her to make decisions on behalf of the people she loves, which is a very particular kind of problem because it is so difficult to separate from genuine care. In the year after Hazel passed, Tawny called every week. She visited every month. She sat with me in the evenings and let me talk about her mother, and I was grateful for every one of those visits. I am still grateful for them. That is the part of this story that I find the hardest to hold. That the beginning was real. Her concern was real. What grew out of it later was something else. But the root of it was real. I think about that when I think about forgiveness. The first sign was so small that I almost cataloged it as nothing. 14 months after Hazel passed, Tawny and Derek came for a Sunday dinner in April. It was a warm evening and we ate on the porch, which Hazel and I had done every Sunday from April through October for 30 years. After dinner, Derek walked the property the way he had never walked it before, hands in his pockets, moving slowly along the fence line, stopping at the corner where the yard meets the creek bank, looking back at the house from a distance. I watched him from the porch. He came back and sat down and said, casually, "You know this lot is probably worth more than the house at this point. Land values in this corridor have gone up significantly." I said, "Is that right?" He said, "The creek frontage alone. There are developers who would pay a premium for this specific kind of parcel." I said, "We've always liked the creek." He smiled. He let it go. But I noticed. 3 weeks later, Tawny called on a Tuesday, which was unusual. She said she had been thinking about practical matters and wanted to raise something she hoped I would consider with an open mind. She said the house was a lot for one person to maintain. She said the property taxes had gone up considerably. She said Derek knew the market and thought the timing was genuinely exceptional. I said I appreciated her thinking of me. She said, "We could get you somewhere easier, Dad. Something that doesn't require so much upkeep. A nice community. People your own age." I said I would think about it. I thought about it for one day. Then I called Chris. He came over that Thursday. We sat on the porch with coffee and I told him what Tawny had said. He was quiet in the way he gets quiet when something is bothering him and he is deciding how much to say. I waited. I had learned a long time ago that Chris needed space to arrive at difficult things. Finally, he said, "Dad, I need to tell you something I should have told you 2 months ago." I said, "Tell me now." He said that a friend of his, a man named Paul Nguyen, whose brother worked in commercial lending in Charlotte, had mentioned that Derek's company was in serious trouble. 2 large mixed-use development projects had stalled. The financing had collapsed on both. A major credit line had been called in by the bank. The company was not in bankruptcy, but it was close to the kind of position where close begins to look like the same thing. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "How bad?" Chris said, "Paul said his brother described it as a company looking for a lifeline." I looked out at the yard, at the garden Hazel had planted along the south fence, at the creek beyond. I said, and the house on Birchwood Lane is worth somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million in the current market. Chris said, yes. We sat there in the quiet for a while. The creek was running. The light was going long and gold the way it does in April in the mountains. I said, I need to make a call. Noel Bachman had handled my business contracts for 15 years before I sold the company. He was 65 now, mostly retired, spending his time on a small horse property outside of Weaverville and taking cases he found interesting. He was the best lawyer I had ever worked with, not because he was the most aggressive, but because he was the most thorough. He had a gift for understanding what was actually happening underneath what appeared to be happening, which is the most useful thing a lawyer can have. I called him on a Thursday evening. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was his habit, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Jason, what does the title on Birchwood look like right now? I told him, solely in my name. Hazel and I had discussed a family trust years ago and had never completed it. After she passed, I had meant to address it and had not. He said, any existing power of attorney? I said no. He said, good. That means to do anything with that property, they need your signature. Which means whatever they're planning, they need your cooperation. Or they need you to believe you have no choice. Or they need you to be in a condition where you can't evaluate what you're signing. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, I'd like you to start keeping notes. Dates, times, exact words. Everything Tawny or Derek say to you about the property or your finances. Everything. I said I understood. He said, and come see me on Monday. We have some work to do. I want to tell you what Noel built over the following 3 weeks, because the structure of it matters. The centerpiece was a revocable living trust, which we named the Merrill Family Trust. The house on Birchwood Lane was transferred into the trust with me as the primary trustee, holding full control of the property during my lifetime. Chris was named successor trustee, meaning he would assume control only in the event of my incapacity or death. Both Tawny and Chris were named as equal beneficiaries. On the surface, it was a document that treated both children identically. In practice, it contained 3 provisions that changed everything. The first was a unanimous consent clause. Any sale, transfer, or encumbrance of the Birchwood property required written agreement from both named beneficiaries. One signature was not enough. The second was a bad faith removal clause. Any beneficiary who attempted to circumvent the consent process or who participated in any scheme to pressure or deceive the trustee into authorizing a transaction could be removed from the trust by the trustee without further legal process. The third was an annotation Noel added at my request. A single paragraph on the last page stating that the trust had been established voluntarily, without duress, by a trustee of sound mind and full legal capacity, witnessed and notarized, for the purpose of ensuring that the family home remained protected in accordance with the wishes of Hazel Marie Merrill, deceased. Noel looked at me when he read that last paragraph back to me. He said, "You sure about that last part?" I said, "She told me to stay until I was ready. I'm putting it in writing." He nodded. He didn't say anything else about it. We signed the trust documents on a Friday morning. Noel's notary witnessed them. Noel gave me a certified copy in a sealed envelope, which I placed in the inside pocket of my good jacket. I called Chris that evening and told him everything. What Noel had built, what I believed Tawny and Derek were planning, what I needed from him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Come to Sunday dinner. I want to tell you what I had written in the notebook by the time Sunday arrived, because those notes are what made everything that came before feel real in a way that could not be disputed." The first entry was from April 14th, 14 months after Hazel passed. Derek's comment about the land value and the creek frontage and the developers who would pay a premium. The second was from May 3rd. Tawny's Tuesday call about the house being too much for one person and Derek knowing the market. The third was from May 17th. Another call from Tawny. She had researched retirement communities in the Asheville area. She named 3 of them. She described the amenities. She said the waiting lists were long and it was better to get on them sooner. The 4th was from May 24th. Derek called me directly, which he had never done before. He said he was in Asheville for a meeting and wondered if he could stop by. He came for coffee. He brought printouts of comparable property sales in the Birchwood neighborhood. He left them on the table when he left, as if by accident. The printouts had handwritten notes in the margins. The notes were in Tawny's handwriting. The 5th was from June 2nd. Tawny called and said she and Derek had spoken with a real estate attorney. She said there were some documents she wanted to bring by on Sunday. Routine paperwork, she said. Just to get the process started. No pressure. I wrote down every word. No pressure. Chris arrived at noon. I made coffee and we sat in the kitchen and talked about his boys and about a fishing trip we had been planning for 2 years and about a woodworking project he had started in his garage. We did not talk about what was coming. There was nothing more to say about it. We had said everything that needed saying. Now we just had to let it arrive. At 1:15, Tawny's car pulled into the driveway. I watched her walk up the path from the kitchen window. She was wearing a blue coat, her mother's favorite color, which I do not think was intentional, but which I noticed anyway. Derek walked behind her, carrying the navy folder. She hugged me at the door. She hugged Chris and seemed genuinely pleased to see him, which told me she had not expected him. Derek shook both our hands and glanced at the folder in his own hands as if he were calculating how to introduce it. We sat at the kitchen table. I had made coffee and put out the shortbread that Hazel used to make, the recipe from her mother, which Chris had made the week before using the handwritten card from the recipe box Hazel kept on the counter for 40 years. Tawny looked around the kitchen the way she always did when she visited, taking inventory of what was the same and what had changed and what the sameness meant about me. She said the house looked good. She said she was glad I had kept up the garden. She said she had been thinking a lot about me and about the future and about what was best. I said I had been thinking about the same things. She looked at Derek. He set the folder on the table. She said, "Dad, I need you to really hear me on this." She opened the folder. She walked me through it. Her voice was careful and warm and rehearsed in the particular way of someone who has gone over the words many times in private. She said the market was exceptional. She said the house was more than I needed and less than I deserved in terms of what it was worth. She said Derek had connections with buyers who would treat the property well and pay a fair price. She said the proceeds would be more than enough for a comfortable retirement community and a substantial amount left over. She said, "You would be taken care of, Dad, completely." She slid the papers across the table. A durable power of attorney, granting Tawny authority to execute property transactions on my behalf, and a property transfer agreement with my name at the top and a blank line near the bottom. She placed the pen beside them. She said, "Just sign here. It's the right thing to do." I looked at the papers. I looked at Derek, who was watching my hands with the focused attention of a man who has been waiting a long time for something. I looked at Tawny, who was watching my face with the certainty of someone who has already decided how the room will go. I picked up the pen. I held it for a moment. Then I set it down. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I took out the sealed envelope. I opened it and placed the certified copy of the Merrill Family Trust on the table between the 4 of us. I said, "Tawny, I think there's been a misunderstanding." The room was completely still. Derek reached for the document first. He read it the way a man reads something he needs to understand quickly because the situation is moving faster than expected. His eyes went down the first page, the second page. He stopped at the unanimous consent clause. I watched his face and I recognized the expression because I had seen it across negotiating tables for 28 years. It is the expression of a man who has just understood that the position he believed he occupied does not exist. He set the document down without saying anything. Tawny picked it up. She read more slowly. When she reached the page with Hazel's name, she stopped. She read that paragraph twice. I watched her face change in a way that had nothing to do with the real estate transaction and everything to do with her mother. She said, "Dad, when did you do this?" I said, "3 weeks ago." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I needed to understand what you were planning before I decided what I needed to do." A long silence. Derek said, "Jason, this doesn't have to be complicated. We can still work through the trust, with both signatures." Chris said, "No." One word, quietly. Derek looked at him. Chris said, "No, we're not doing that." Derek looked at me. I said, "Derek, I know about the credit line. I know about the 2 stalled projects. I know what your company needs, and I understand why this house looked like a solution." I kept my voice level because I had spent 28 years in business keeping my voice level when it mattered. But this house is where my wife spent 43 years of her life. It is not a transaction. It is not a solution to someone else's financial problem, and it was never yours to decide what happened to it. Tawny had not said anything for a while. She was still holding the trust document. She was looking at the paragraph about Hazel. I said, "Stay for dinner. Both of you. Chris made your mother's shortbread and it's almost as good as hers. But those papers go home with you." Derek stood up after a moment. He picked up his folder. He said something about needing to get back to Charlotte for an early call, and he was sorry for the confusion. He was already moving toward the door. Tawny did not move immediately. She sat in her mother's chair with the trust document in her hands, and she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was a child. Not calculation, not certainty. Something younger and more honest than either of those things. She said, "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." I said, "I know you did." She said, "I didn't mean for it to." She stopped. She looked at the document again, at Hazel's name on the last page. "I didn't know you'd done this for Mom." I said, "Most of what I've done in this house has been for your mother." She set the document on the table. She did not take her papers. She sat with us for another hour, and we ate shortbread and drank coffee and talked about Hazel the way we used to talk about her in the early months, openly and without trying to make it tidy. It was the best hour I had spent with my daughter in a long time. Derek waited in the car. Derek's company filed for restructuring 6 weeks later. It was in the business section of the Charlotte Observer, 3 paragraphs, the kind of news that arrives quietly for the people it concerns and doesn't arrive at all for anyone else. Tawny called me when it happened. She did not use the words "I'm sorry," but she said, "I should have just told you what was going on instead of trying to fix it without asking you." I told her that was enough. It was enough. She and Derek are working through it. That is their work to do, and I have stayed out of it except to tell Tawny once, when she called on a Tuesday evening sounding hollowed out, that the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who tell you the truth when it's inconvenient. She said, "Is that directed at me?" I said, "It's directed at both of us." Noelle sent me a bottle of good bourbon after the trust documents were finalized. The card said simply, "Well played. I keep it on the shelf above Hazel's reading chair. I have not opened it yet. I am waiting for the right occasion." Chris brings the boys over on the second Saturday of every month. They fish in the creek and track mud through the hallway and argue about which one caught more, and it is the best sound this house has made in 3 years. Last month, the older one asked me how long we had lived here, and I told him since before his father was born, and he looked at the house with the particular expression of a child who has just understood that some things are older than they can fully imagine and therefore important. I am planting dahlias along the east fence this spring. Hazel always wanted them there, and I never got around to it when she was alive. I am getting around to it now. There are things I want you to hear if you are a person who has lost someone and found yourself, in the quiet that follows, surrounded by people who speak about your future in your presence as though you are not quite in the room. Grief is not incapacity. Silence is not surrender. A man who has spent 43 years building a life inside 4 walls knows exactly what those walls are worth, and it is not a number on a property listing. The house on Birchwood Lane is still mine. The garden is coming back strong. The creek is running the way it has always run, cold and clear and completely indifferent to property values. Hazel told me to stay until I was ready. I am still here. I want to hear from you in the comments. Has someone ever mistaken your grief for weakness? Tell me what happened. I read every single one.